Joel. Good evening, Erica. Good to see you from Norway. She's our regular. Just a moment there. We're going to share it. Okay, we're live there. Let's just share that here. Happy Lag BaOmer, Erica, to you as well. Good evening, Mercedes. Okay, let's do this here. Good evening, Roberto. Good evening, Danielle. Almost there, last one, and we're good to go. Laila Tov, Erev Tov. Laila Tov is what you say when you want the person to go to sleep. I hope that's not what you want. Erev Tov means good evening. Good evening from Long Island. What a beautiful crowd gathering together on Lag BaOmer. If I wasn't indoors, I would light a big fire and we'd celebrate with a bonfire. Good evening, Luis. Good evening, Jim. And we are ready to go. We shared it on every social media platform available, and we are good to go. Tonight is Lag BaOmer. So before I begin, I'd like to take a moment to dedicate our study tonight in loving memory of the 45 souls, the 45 Jewish neshamas that perished last Lag BaOmer in Meron, in the holy city of Meron. The terrible tragedy last year, a human tragedy of simply a disorganized celebration that caused human trampling, that took the life of 45 beautiful souls that had come to celebrate at the resting place of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. It is our hope that all the work that the Israeli government has done this past year to secure that location and to create a system of law and order will hopefully result in no, God forbid, no tragedies and only good things coming out of Meron. I'd also like to take a moment on a personal note. This is a very auspicious night tonight on Lag BaOmer. On this night on Lag BaOmer in 1952, there was a wonderful soul that came down to this world. It was born in Rishon LeZion in central Israel. And had he not been born on this day, I wouldn't be here to give you a class tonight. And so I'd like to dedicate tonight's class to my father's 70th birthday. My father was born on Lag BaOmer in Israel, 1952. And he had the great honor, the great merit to be the first Chabad child in the world to be named after the Rebbe's father. The Rebbe's father was killed by the communists, indirectly killed by the communists in 1944 in Kazakhstan. But the Rebbe only assumed leadership of the Chabad movement in 1950. And so most Chabad people didn't know the Rebbe's father. And so any child that was born after 1950 was naturally named for the previous Rebbe, previous Chabadnik Rebbe, whose name was Yosef Yitzchak. And then in 1952, in the spring of 1952, after my grandmother gave birth to her fifth child, my father, the fifth of 10 children, a great chassid in Israel named Rabbi Yosef Raskin, who was a moil and a very, very prestigious chassid, came to my grandfather and said, listen, I have an idea. You know, the Rebbe's been Rebbe now for 2 years, and no one has named their child to honor the Rebbe by naming their child for his father. It would be a big thing for the Rebbe to have someone named for his father. So without asking the Rebbe, just the day of the bris came, and my grandfather named my father instead of Yosef Yitzchak for the previous Rebbe, he named him Levi Yitzchak for the Rebbe's father, and that led to a 13-year special relationship between the Rebbe's mother, who was still alive till 1964, and the Rebbe and my father. She would send gifts from New York. She would send gift certificates to buy my father clothing. My grandmother used to send pictures of my father as a child. We have so many pictures of my father as a child, which was very uncommon in the 50s, but because my grandmother made sure to get so many photographers to take pictures because the Rebbe needed to see pictures. So it was a very special relationship. We just FaceTimed my father from the dinner table. God willing, next week, and actually I should mention that next week there will not be class because we're traveling to New York, my entire family, with all my siblings and their family to celebrate together with my father at a family reunion. But we just FaceTime with him on this very special day. And I'd like to dedicate our study today because what I have and what you have is really his. At Ilav Hayom If it wasn't for today and my father's birth, we wouldn't be here in this forum. We wouldn't be here to celebrate together. Now that I got that long dedication out of the way, let's get into some deep Lag BaOmer thought. So we are in chapter 4 this week of Ethics of Our Fathers of Pirkei Avot. And one of the things it says in chapter 4 is as follows. Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua said, "Let the honor of your student be as dear to you as your own." So when dealing with students, you have to treat your student with the same honor you would want for yourself. And then it says the honor of your colleague as the reverence for your teacher. So the way you treat a colleague, someone who's sitting in the yeshiva study hall studying with you, you should treat your colleague who you're discussing Torah with and debating Torah values and ideas and thought with the same reverence and respect with which you treat your teacher. And then it concludes that Mishnah and the reverence of your teacher as the fear of heaven. You should treat your teacher with the same reverence, your Torah teacher, not your teacher for geography. I mean, you should still respect your teacher for geography, but the context of the Mishnah is talking about the Torah teacher, the one who's teaching you the ways of Hashem, that you should respect them the way, or fear them, revere them the way you fear Hashem, the way you have fear of heaven. And I bring that up, obviously it's the 4th week of the Pirkei Avot, and that's what we're studying, but it's very much connected to this time of year when we commemorate and celebrate. It's both a commemoration and a celebration of Lag BaOmer. Because, I was learning a letter from the Rabbi this morning. I have a chavrusa, I have a study partner every Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock. He lives in Pittsburgh and we learn on Zoom and we learn letters of the Rabbi. And the Rabbi in this particular letter in Iyar in the spring of 1952, oddly enough, the Rebbe is addressing a yahrzeit. And the Rebbe says that a yahrzeit is a very, very conflicting, it's a day with conflicting emotions. On the one hand, you're celebrating the fact that the soul of your loved one whose yahrzeit you're commemorating is being elevated to a new elevation because it's the day of the yahrzeit. And we know that according to Kabbalah, the soul is elevated to great heights and continues to grow in its spiritual experience on high. But on the other hand, the person in this world, on the day of the yahrzeit, can't help themselves but to think about the loss of their loved one. But the Rebbe says the truth is it shouldn't really be opposing feelings. The feelings shouldn't be one of sadness and happiness for the soul and sadness for us. On the contrary, the Rebbe says it should be sort of this union of happiness for the soul and introspection for us, sincere introspection of what we can do, just like the soul in heaven is growing in its own spiritual endeavors. Are we growing too? Right? Are we matching up with the soul of the person we're commemorating in our own? If the soul in heaven is experiencing spiritual growth, are we, those who are living here, living their legacy, if you wish, in this world, are we also experiencing spiritual growth, or are we stagnant? Right? Are we experiencing stagnation while they're growing? And so in that context, it's interesting that as we come to a yahrzeit of Lag BaOmer, and it's the yahrzeit of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, the great sage of the Talmud. But before we get to Reb Shimon ben Yochai, it really is the story about Rabbi Akiva and his students. And we need to take a moment to sort of go back to the basics. Who was Rabbi Akiva and what went wrong? And so what I share with you tonight is a combination of 2 talks that the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, blessed memory, gave on Lag BaOmer, in the spring of 1953 and in the spring of 1957. So Rabbi Akiva is if you study Avot the Reb Nassim, which is a form of Talmud, the oral tradition, it tells us that Rabbi Akiva, he wasn't Rabbi Akiva, he was just Akiva. That was his name. He was a shepherd, and he worked for a very wealthy Jewish businessman in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem. And of course, Rabbi Akiva's, for lack of a better term, his master, the one he worked for, had a daughter who really liked Rabbi Akiva. Eventually, her name was Rachel, her name was Rachel. They get married. She's thrown out of the home because her father doesn't want to marry that peasant, that ignoramus of shepherd. I don't know, and it took over a decade until her father and his father-in-law realized that he became this great Torah scholar and eventually helped him become wealthy himself. But how did Rabbi Akiva how did he go from being a shepherd to being a Torah scholar? So the Talmud tells us this incredible tale. It tells us that he was a shepherd, and as he would walk with the flock, as he would shepherd the flock, he would see certain locations in which little drops of water every day, every week, every month would continue. Droplets of water kept coming down in the same spot on hard stone. And eventually he saw holes being formed in the stone or indentations being formed in the stone. And he said to himself at a certain point, he said, if such soft water can make an indentation, perhaps even a hole in a hard stone, then no matter how tough it's going to be for me, no matter how many obstacles I'm going to encounter, both because of my poor background, financially, very, very poor person, and also because of his ignorance. He was simply an ignoramus. He was a Ben Gerim. He came from a descendant of converts to Judaism. He did not come from some glamorous Jewish background with great Jewish thinkers and intellectuals. Nevertheless, he said to himself, it may take some days, it may take some weeks, it may take some years, decades. I have the ability to overcome every so-called insurmountable obstacle and become a Torah. He wasn't looking to be a Torah giant. He was looking to be a learned Jew. And so he did. He went on this journey, a journey that lasted 24 years, to a point that he had thousands, tens of thousands of Jewish students. He also became financially well off because his father-in-law invited him back. But what's interesting is what we get to learn when you read that story about Rabbi Akiva, how he went from being Akiva the shepherd to Rabbi Akiva, one of the most synonymous names with Jewish academic study that exists, with extrapolation of Jewish law, codification of Jewish law. Rabbi Akiva, a farmer boy, a shepherd boy who knew nothing about Judaism, knew nothing about Torah depth, and turns himself into this great scholar. And what it teaches us, that first and foremost, if you really want it, if you have the real willpower, you definitely will succeed. Torah study is not only for an exclusive group. Torah study is not an exclusivity. It's not the Yellowstone Club. Torah study is not made for a certain group of people and everyone else is not part of it. Torah is accessible to anyone willing to put their mind and body and heart in total devotion to the incredible infinite wisdom of Hashem. As it says actually in Parshas B'chukoisai, which is next week's Torah portion. Many years it's read in combination, but in Parshas B'chukoisai it says, Im b'chukotai telechu, if you will go in my statutes. And what does Rashi say? That shetiu amelim b'Torah, that you can include, that the greatest accomplishment a person can find is when you, in Yiddish we call it harav. You know what that means? To toil in Torah, right? We're used to learning, when I say we, the American version of study in general is not so deep. Right? You speak to a college student, they're quickly reading through some papers so they can get through the test, the exam. Doctors are reading their annual CM, what are they called? CMEs? Just like you have CLEs or CLEs, they have their, what are they called? They read through, you got to read through a lot of paperwork and make sure you can pass is it multiple choice? The multiple choice test that they give you. Right? Learning Torah should not be a superficial. You shouldn't read the Torah like you read a newspaper. Oh, what a beautiful concept. If Rabbi Akiva had learned Torah the way you read the Chronicle or the way you read the Billings Gazette, then he would not become a Torah scholar. It would have never happened. The reason he became who he was and was able to become an incredible, not just an incredible Torah student, but an incredible Torah teacher, was because he took toil of Torah very seriously. He busted his chops. He racked his brains to try to understand the layers and layers and layers of depth. Right? The Torah generally is divided into 4 categories of Torah study, of which Rabbi Akiva had access to all 4, like every one of us. Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Soid. Pshat is the most basic understanding of the verse. Remez are the hints that exists in Torah study, the gematria, the numerical value of each letter and how that relates to the concept, and various other forms of hints that exist within words of Torah. And then there's drush, the homiletical, the way you take a Torah idea out of its basic literal understanding and you use it to teach many other values and ethics and ideas that are very much Jewish values and ideas. And then there's Soid, which is also very much connected to today. We'll talk about that in a moment. Soid is the mystical, the esoteric, the brightness of Torah, the illumination of Torah, which is in Kabbalah and Hasidic teaching. Rabbi Akiva went down that path because Rabbi Akiva understood by looking at that rock that there is no such thing. I can't. Right? We get excited, and rightfully so, when we see these social media posts of a black kid that grew up in an impoverished home that becomes a big lawyer. He puts himself through high school, and then he puts himself through college, and who knows what. And about a white kid coming out of Kansas, out of the middle of Hudson Futz, Kansas, and he becomes a big macher because he put it right. We get impressed, as we should. Rabbi Akiva was the original. He was the original guy who, at 40 years old, he wasn't 20 years old shepherd and said, at 40 years old, you start a new career. Not only that, you shift away. Imagine a shepherd, a guy's a rancher at 40. He says, you know what? I'm done being a rancher at 40. I'm going to go become a professor at Harvard. Imagine a rancher from Big Timber says, that's it, I'm done. I'm done being a rancher. I'm done calving. What is it? Calving? What's the calf? Huh?
You said it right. Calving.
Calving. I'm done the branding. I'm done milking. That's it. I'm giving up the ranch. Harvard professorship. Here I come. We would all burst out laughing. If he was 20 and he said it, maybe. But at 40, I'm 40. Imagine tomorrow. I told you I'm becoming a mechanic. You say, Rabbi, by the time you finish learning to be a mechanic, you'll be 60, which is probably true. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible, but Rabbi Akiva at 40 decided to become who he was. And that's an incredible lesson for us, but it's important to focus on his students as well, because his students made a colossal mistake, which is why Lag BaOmer is connected to us all together. In the days after Pesach, after Passover, all the way till Lag BaOmer, till tonight, 24,000 of Rabbi Akiva's students died in a plague. And I don't mean a plague like Ebola or COVID. They died in a godly plague. God said, I've had enough of these students. I'm going to have them all drop dead. Why? It says, they didn't respect each other. They didn't treat each other with respect. Now, they weren't making fun of each other. They weren't calling each other names. They weren't telling them you're a communist, or you have no heart, or you have no brain, or whatever else we call each other today in politics. They weren't arguing over Roe v. Wade. They weren't arguing over election rights. That's not what they were arguing about. They were arguing about Torah, but in a disrespectful way. And they claimed the most holy of agendas. I'm not really hating on my friend, but I care about them so much I cannot sit by and let them misunderstand Rabbi Akiva's teaching like that. I must educate them and I must lambast them and bombard them because I believe that for their sake, they need to understand Rabbi Akiva's teachings better. Right? It's always the ones that tell you, I'm doing it for you. Like the father who says he's never home because he's trying to make a living for the kid. The kid doesn't even know his father. He couldn't pick him out in a lineup because he never met him, but he's telling the kid that the reason I went to work 30 hours a day was because of you. Right? Rabbi Akiva's students were saying, I'm hating on you, I'm disrespecting you because I love you. That's a level of arrogance that was worthy of their death. And actually, we don't even know any of their names. History forgot them all. 24,000 Torah scholars who lacked respect are gone and vanished from the map of Jewish history. And Rabbi Akiva had 5 students who we spoke about in the first week of Ethics of Our Fathers, and Rabbi Akiva's, the students who survived, we know a lot about. But you know why they survived? Because they learned how to treat each other, how you can study Torah and also express love and respect and dignity for another human being. And it's such a vital teaching. So we learn about Rabbi Akiva, about the power of learning Torah and toiling in Torah no matter what. But how you learn Torah is also vital, right? From Ethics of Our Fathers, we read from Pirkei Avot, the honor of your colleague is the reverence for your teacher. You can't walk around and say, oh, I'm a big student of my teacher, my Rebbe, my blah, 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 and then trash the other student because you don't believe in their way of studying. And so if we are going to study in a way that is in sync with what Rabbi Akiva really stood for, and that we should not, God forbid, encounter a plague where people die due to disrespect and treating people in an undignified manner, then we need to live up to Akiva's philosophy of how the right students, the surviving students, the ones whose names we do know, taught Torah. And that's why Lag BaOmer is the first reason Lag BaOmer is such a big deal, is because today is the day in which Rabbi Akiva students stopped dying. And that's a big deal. It was that moment where we said, wow. It was a moment of introspection to say, what did we just witness? What did we just experience? How did that happen? How did Rabbi Akiva students mess up so badly and then take that to heart and learn how to have respect? And if you can't keep your mouth shut, or better yet, if you feel like you have to comment in a derogatory way, then instead of saying anything, walk away or keep your mouth shut. It's Lag BaOmer. Lag BaOmer is the reminder that human dignity and Talmudic dignity for your fellow colleague is more important than your scholarship. And that comes from a guy like Rabbi Akiva, who was the epitome of scholarship, and yet dignity comes above that. I mean, that's Chabad. I realized this week that it's a very bad term we use, Chabad philosophy, because philosophy sounds like it's a philosophy, which is theoretical. So I'm going to try, to the best of my ability, to shift to Chabad practice. Chabad practice is to treat human beings, every human being, with dignity, to focus on the soul, not on the body. And that's really why we find ourselves that if you want to take education, if you want to take this importance of dignity and respect really to the place that it belongs, it needs to start from youth. Right? People ask me all the time, Chaya, can you find the Rambam Shoftim? The last one, it should say Shoftim or Judges. The people say all the time, Rabbi, how do we solve the division in our country? How do we solve the division in the world? And the truth is, it can only come about when we educate our youth that there's nothing more important than respect and dignity. You don't have to agree with other people's lifestyles. And actually, I don't have to buy every baba mice, every brainstorm that you come up with of how I have to see you and I have to talk to you and you're obligated to talk this way and that way. Actually, I don't have to do any of that. I'm a Torah Jew and I have to live according to the Torah and live up to the values of the Torah. So I don't have to accept every baba mice that comes out in the world. But to treat human beings with respect, always. It's the number one Jewish value, recognizing that every human being is created in the image of God and respecting them for that itself. And if we can go there, first of all, we wouldn't have to speak about Rabbi Akiva students because there wouldn't be a plague. They would have respected each other, wouldn't have to go down that path. And be careful of those who say they're cursing you out because they love you. That's the first group of people you better run from. Right? Rabbi Akiva is the one who taught his students. Right? Think about that. He's the one that taught us that loving your fellow as yourself, Zeklal Gadol Torah, is a great principle of Torah. And yet it was his students who totally lost track of that mitzvah. How is that possible? Because they used love as an excuse for why they can trash you and why they can. We love the world so much that we have to get rid of those that don't love the way we love. We love you so much that I have to alienate you and hate you because I love you. That's our biggest BS Baba Maisa that anyone ever came up with. I don't need you to love me. It's not a bad idea. But what if I don't feel like loving you? Can you at least express your love with respect? Can you respect me? Can you allow me to exist in the world that you live in, even if I totally, wholeheartedly disagree with you, polar opposite of what you believe? You know, Lag BaOmer naturally is celebrated in the time between Passover and Shavuos. And if you look at the one theme, right, it's almost like the bridge. It's the day that bridges Passover and Shavuos. In 2.5 weeks, we're going to celebrate Shavuos, the giving of the Torah. And 5 weeks ago, or 4.5 weeks ago, we celebrated Pesach, Passover, the Exodus from Egypt. And so Lag BaOmer is like the bridge that brings these two holidays together. When we count the Omer and we get ready for Shavuos, and then there's Lag BaOmer. And what do we find about the Exodus from Egypt and the giving of the Torah? Something fascinating. We find that there was an obsession with children. That when the Jews were leaving Egypt, the Jewish children were the first ones to see the divinity at the splitting of the sea. They were the first ones to say Pakadati, that God is going to take us out of this horrific exile. How did they? Where did the Jewish children get so educated in Egypt? Says the Medrash that the Jewish children were being educated by the tribe of Levi. You know, the tribe of Levi was not forced to work. The Egyptians didn't force their slave labor upon the tribe of Levi. The tribe of Levi was studying Torah in the city of Goshen, the Jewish city in Egypt at the time, and they ensured that whichever Jewish children survived, that were not killed by the Egyptian, the Egyptian tyrants. They got an education of the values of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? And Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, Rachel, and Leah. When you come to the giving of the Torah, there's a fascinating Medrash, Shir Hashirim. The Medrash on Song of Songs says that when the Jews stood at Sinai, God said to the Jews, "You want my Torah? I need a guarantor. Who's going to guarantee that you guys are going to actually live up to these Torah values?" So the Jews answered, they said, our forefathers will be our guarantors, meaning, come on, God, we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Their spiritual aura over the Jewish people will guarantee that we will keep the Torah. God said, sorry, no can do. They had issues. So the Jews said, the Nevi'im, the prophets, will be our guarantors. God said, no can do. They got issues. And they went through and finally said, our children will be our guarantors. And God said, done. You got yourself a deal. If you can imbue and permeate Yiddishkeit and Torah values to the youth, they will ensure that Yiddishkeit, that Judaism, will have a future. It's interesting that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a student of Rabbi Akiva, and who was the second story of Lag BaOmer, was that Lag BaOmer was the day of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's passing, which is why we go to Meron in northern Israel. And he said that on the day of my passing, I want you to celebrate. It's the day that my soul comes together, and it's all its glory. My life work is coming together. But what's interesting, the Zohar, which was authored by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, you know what it says? It says, and I only saw this today for the first time, so either I'm ignorant or I missed it in yeshiva. I just discovered it today. Said that at the era before Mashiach comes, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai said this 1,800 years ago, that in the era before Mashiach has come, not only will adults, but even children will be able to learn the deepest, most esoteric teachings of the Torah, the Sod, the mystical, the Jewish mysticism, Jewish esoteric teachings will be available even to the youth. And when that happens, we will have a youth that's worthy of marching us out of exile like they did in Egypt, and marching us to a state of redemption, to a state of Mashiach. And so when we're talking about education and dignity and respect, and Rabbi Akiva and his values and how he imparted that to his students, we must take into consideration that education begins, it's never too late for education. Rabbi Akiva started at 40. Could you imagine if Rabbi Akiva would have started at 12? Imagine if he had a father that was able to give him that education. Imagine he had a yeshiva to go to. Imagine you have a grandchild that you can sit down on your knee when you have an opportunity and say, Bubala, can I tell you a nice Jewish story that will elevate your soul and bring you sparks of spirit to your life? Don't lose the opportunity to bring the depth and beauty and vibrancy of Yiddishkeit to youth, even with mysticism, like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, because you have no idea what that can do, not just for them and their future children, but the future of the Jewish people and the future of humanity. That's what Lag BaOmer is. Yes, it's about bonfires, and yes, it's about barbecues, and yes, it's about bow and arrows, and yes, it's about going to Meron, but most importantly, it's about learning the lessons of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and how we can internalize what they teach. And it's apropos, truly a beautiful thing. And for those of you that get my daily videos, maybe you saw it this morning, so I apologize. But today was also the Siyam Rambam. Today, for those that study, as the Rebbe instituted in the 1980s, to learn 3 chapters of Rambam, of Maimonides every day. And those that can't do 3 chapters, do 1 chapter. And if you can't do that, you can do Sefer HaMitzvahs, which is very easy to implement, which is the daily mitzvahs of the Rambam. And But I do have the honor of studying 3 chapters, and today we concluded the 14 volumes of Rambam Maimonides' codification of Jewish law, and tomorrow we'll start the process over. And the last halacha, right, the siyum, if you look at the completion, the last halacha, so it's the laws of kings and wars, chapter 12, Mishnah, halacha 5, says as follows: in that era, in the era of Mashiach, there will be neither famine or war, envy or competition. For good will flow in abundance, and all the delights will be freely available as dust. The occupation of the entire world will be solely to know God. It just sounds so utopian. Therefore, the Jews will be great sages and know the hidden matters, right? The hidden matters. Not just the exoteric teachings of the Torah, but the esoteric, grasping the knowledge of their Creator according to the full extent of human potential. As Yeshaya the prophet Isaiah states, "Umola ha'oretz de'as Hashem kamayim li'amachasim." The world will be filled with the knowledge of God as the waters cover the ocean bed. If we talk about internalizing Rabbi Akiva's teaching, internalizing what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai stood for, it's a world. Right? If there's a world filled with the knowledge of God, then there's no arrogance, and there's no disrespect, and there's no haughtiness, and there's no hate, because it can't be if the world is full with the knowledge of Hashem. And this completes the Hilchos Malachim and the entire text. Blessed be he who spoke, and the world came into being as a whole with all its particulars. And truly, that's the Siyum Rambam. That's the conclusion of the Rambam. And it's very much connected to tonight as we usher in on Lag BaOmer. So with that in mind, I'm going to wish each of you, no matter what your age is, to stop finding excuses, stop finding reasons to negate your opportunity for Torah study. Delve deep, delve hard, use that brain, stop mushing the brain, using it for mush, for politics and news. It's a waste of your brain's energy and existence. It's a waste of oxygen. Learn Torah, learn it deep, share it with anyone you can, especially the youth, even, perhaps most importantly, the esoteric teachings. And if you've never done the cycle of Rambam, if you've never taken the opportunity to do at least the mitzvahs of the day, it's doable. It will take you 4 minutes a day. You can get it on an app, you can get it in an email, you can get it, probably today you can probably get it on a text message straight into you. You can get it any way you want. So if you don't know how to sign up, send me a message and I will tell you. Send it on Facebook, send it on YouTube, send it wherever. I will get you the info that tomorrow on Lag BaOmer you can begin a journey of Torah knowledge. And by the end of the year, you'll say, wow, I studied all 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. I'm a legitimate Torah scholar, making Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and me very, very proud. Have a wonderful night. Remember, next week, unless there's let's just say if you see me here next week, it's not a good sign. I'm supposed to be in New York with my family, looking forward to it, and I'll see you back here the following week. Be'ezrat Hashem Yitbarach, Hafredach Lag BaOmer. Stay safe, stay bright, and we'll see you back here soon.
I thought you were going to say the most important. I don't know.
If you're on Zoom, you're welcome to ask any questions if there are, or comments.